Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Munganyi. We're coming to you from Facebook Live with the man himself, Shaka. Shaka, Ndugu Shaka, how are you doing today?
I am hugely terrific,
It's good to
Jackson.
be here in this seat hosting you again.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Did you have a good
again.
weekend?
Incredible.
Yes. So where do we start? Let's start off in France, in Paris. The story of this young man who the video shows him climbing, scaling a building, trying to save this young baby. What did you make of that video and the actions of this young man?
Well, to be very honest with you, I wasn't surprised because to me, that act seems to be a reflection, frankly, of what you would call African culture. We come from extended relationships,
Right.
families and what have you. And we're talking about the traditional African culture. We are supposed to be there for each other.
Willing to take risks for each other.
Precisely.
Help each other out when the moment calls for it.
Precisely, and I'm glad that he did it. And he's not the first person to do something like that, really, sacrificing his life in those types of circumstances. I'm reminded also of another example of another great African human being who happened to be in a very small northern Italian city several months back. He was from Nigeria. He also did not have papers. He was illegal. He was a hawker on the streets and stuff like that. There was an Italian white man who went around shooting at people and all that kind of stuff. And this is the guy who actually arrested him, not the police.
This Nigerian immigrant in Italy.
Nigerian.
A story that did not receive, I guess, as much media attention as this one in Paris. And we should mention that many of these young people, for example, this Gassama young man, 22-year-old, did not do it for attention, did not do it so he can get French citizenship, which was awarded to him later on after his heroic act. They just do it, like you said, out of, it is part of who we are.
Precisely, but also I think we have to give credit to where it belongs, frankly, because look at the French president, Emmanuel Macron. He basically makes a telephone call to him and invites him to the Élysée Paris, to their state house in a way, and look what he does to him and what have you. I mean, we have to give him credit.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
the other Nigerian also, by the way, the Italian authorities did pretty much the same thing to him. I don't remember him meeting a prime minister or meeting a president or a senator or whatever, but eventually, the police itself said that it was going to help him have his papers being processed so that he can actually be legalized.
Right, which is a big thing in this atmosphere and immigration atmosphere where we see around the world these nationalist movements that have sought to cast this shadow over immigrants, immigration, you know, some of them calling them animals, like we saw recently in the case of the United States President Donald Trump calling immigrants animals, and many others in many parts of the attacks on immigrants in Europe, here in the US, and many places. And this, in a way, shows the humanity, the shared humanity. That's what I got away from this, and I think it was
that we have, of course, as human beings, who science tells us, at least the current science that I'm aware of, that all of us, so religious people tell us that we are all children of God.
Right.
But science tells us that all of us, in fact, may have originated through that kid in a place called Olduvai Gorge.
Yes.
In Tanzania.
In Tanzania, yes.
And then we spread around the world.
Right.
And then when you go into history later, even before the European colonized Africa and what have you, these people used to go to places like Mali, what we call Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa and what have you, with no visas.
Right.
They would go there and do whatever they do and get, you know, they became rich. As a matter of fact, I was reading a book called How Europe Developed Africa. It's
the
a
great
classic by Walter Rodney.
Walter Rodney, yes.
From Guyana.
Right.
This guy, he talks about, in fact, could have said how Africa developed Europe and North America.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. All these great civilizations that have a source of their genesis is in Africa. Let's move along. You mentioned Rwanda, one of the other big stories making news around the continent, including here in America, was the story of Rwanda. The Rwandan government signed a deal with Arsenal, a team in the UK, in England, part of the, I guess, the British soccer league, the English league, to advertise. I guess the campaign is called Visit Rwanda, where they have their name of Visit Rwanda right on their sleeves.
For 2 years.
And there's a lot of controversy around that.
For 2 years. It's not only Visit Rwanda, by the way. The president of Rwanda, with his friends, are also guaranteed to go to the stadium in England and sit in one of these great, expensive royal boxes owned by the Emirates.
Right, it's a standard package for every sponsor.
And free tickets and you name it. But
what do you make of that controversy that many are saying that Rwanda, as a poor country, should not be engaging in acts of what they say returning? I guess, you know, they receive foreign aid, the country receives foreign aid, they shouldn't be giving money to an English team, a team in a country that gives them foreign aid.
Well, it is very interesting because when you talk to some of those people who have studied the subject of foreign aid, they will tell you that in most cases, for every $1 US that is given to a country like Rwanda as foreign aid, probably, only 20 cents ends up right there. And actually that's something for the people of Rwanda, because the country that actually provides foreign aid sometimes uses that as a way of providing jobs to its own people.
Right. So much of the foreign aid that is supposed to come on the continent usually ends
sometimes ends here. Yeah. Even most of it, in fact, never actually leaves, because you get tenders, contracts, you know, for companies and all that kind of stuff.
But in this case, I guess the story is not really about foreign aid. It's about a marketing strategy that Rwanda felt, you know, they're making $400 million every year. They want to increase that. Tourism is their biggest foreign exchange earner. I guess spending only $10 million a year to try and get more money makes sense to them.
Well, it's not $10 million. We're talking about $30 million the last time I checked.
Over the course of
for 2 years.
2 years, right.
So we're talking about $15 million each day. I mean, each year. Well, let's face it. No matter what you say about Major General Paul Kagame, retired but not tired, and the president of the Republic of Rwanda, when it comes to marketing, he is a master at it. There's no question that he has done a great job selling Rwanda. When you look probably at Rwanda's government budget, in terms of public relations and what have you, I am sure that probably it competes with some very key ministries. And let's face it, a lot of people know where Rwanda is. Beyond the genocide that occurred in 1994, a lot of people know about Rwanda's beauty. People have gone there to see the gorillas and all that kind of stuff. They are talking about the International Conference Center that was built there.
Right. The investment in its aviation industry.
Precisely.
Right.
Even though, of course, some critics say that, you know, Rwanda Airlines is pretty much permanently in the red.
Right.
But it's there. And then you talk about, of course, how clean. I mean, I was looking at Africa's most, I think, 10 most beautiful cities and what have you. And Rwanda ranks very, I mean, Kigali ranks very, very
One
highly
of the most
up
beautiful
there.
cities, absolutely.
Of course, other people might say, wait a minute, is this a city, in fact, for the indigenous Rwandans and what have you? What do they benefit from that? But let's face it, Kagame has done a great job of marketing his country. Then you can talk about, of course, some of the critics who are coming from Britain. Britain says that it actually provides Rwanda with about 62 million pounds sterling in terms of aid every year. And yet, they say, look at Kagame, how can he possibly, almost half of that actually, contribute to our indigenous football company? That this, to them actually, they say that it probably wasn't a particularly good diplomatic sort of public relations.
Well, I guess the long-term strategy for Rwanda in this case, understanding they don't have a lot of natural resources, the best way is to sell the country so people can come and visit. So whatever you have to do.
It's not surprising because aren't they in fact building perhaps one of the best airports, you know, in the region?
Right.
And let's face it, you know when you monitor Kagame, that is a man who has actually been traveling the world. He reminds me a little bit of a former Tanzanian president, a guy called Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete. This is a guy that some of his critics used to characterize him as Vasco da Gama. And you know the historical context in which you bring in Vasco da Gama, who obviously, you know, sailed from Portugal and went to the Cape of Good Hope and what have you. This is a man who loved to travel. And he had to do that, let's face it. The man was foreign minister for 10 years. Right. This was because back in 1995, he won the election from Chama cha Mapinduzi. He was supposed to be the president, in a sense, succeeding Ali Hassan Mwinyi, but the founding leader of Tanzania at that time, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, said, you know what, this is not about a beauty contest. And this is a very beautiful man, very handsome man. But he was called Vasco da Gama. So when you talk about that and you look at Kagame's travels and what have you, you could probably say that Kagame has actually become a Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus and Marco Polo rolled into one.
Right. Let's move on to the next one. I know we're going to talk about South Sudan later on, but in the context of foreign aid and countries that receive foreign aid and how they use it, one of the other stories that is making news is in Kenya right now, the big scandal. So many people part of an agency, I guess a youth agency that was supposed to provide training to young people who basically took 100% of the money, you know.
And the serial board, of course, which is part of, it's like a parastatal that is under the Ministry of Agriculture. I am told that they might also, in fact, have to look at the power, the energy sort of kind of parastatal. But when you talk about corruption, Jackson, you know, let's face it, there's nothing new about this. When you talk about Kenya, you have to go back to 1963, when Kenya actually regained its political independence from the British.
Right, right.
Some critics have actually said that the founding president, initially he was a prime minister, Jomo Kenyatta, a man from Gatundu, who happens to be, in fact,
the father
of the
current
president, Uhuru Kenyatta, that he actually introduced two very important things that have really not helped Kenya very much. That one was corruption, and he was actually, he reportedly have been involved in a lot of land acquisitions. Some critics, in fact, used to describe him as very earthy. He used to wear these very expensive, you know, suits from Savile Row in London, but he also acquired a lot of this land that otherwise belonged to people like the Darameas and what have you.
The land that had been taken by the settlers,
and then the tribe thing.
Yes.
So these are the two things. Right. So when you talk about his son eventually trying to figure out how to solve this issue of corruption, there are people who say, obviously, this is a significant step in the right direction. Right. He should be able to do it. But some of the critics are also saying, wait a minute, this is not really about fighting corruption. Right. This is something political. About legacy. About legacy. Right. And in fact, there is one gentleman who happens to be a very prominent economist in Kenya. He got his PhD from one of Britain's finest universities, Oxford, called David Ndii. He also happened to be associated with the opposition, especially with Raila Odinga and NASA. Right. He recently said, look, this is not about fighting corruption. This, in a sense, is about Kenyatta getting an opportunity to sanitize himself for legacy. Right, right. And in the end, he probably has to end figuring out who should be the fall guy. Right. And that fall guy is probably the deputy president, a man called William Ruto, and that he's trying to actually, in his words, not mine, to perhaps finish him politically. Right. If you're just joining us, this is Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. We are here with the man, Shaka himself, answering questions. Shaka, let's go to our first question from a listener, Kiprop Kale Emmanuel, and his question is about South Sudan. He says, I would like to know what has failed the peace talk agreement between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. Well,
interesting question.
It reminds me about a lot of previous, perhaps, peace talks that a lot of different countries, frankly, went through. You could talk about Rwanda in 1993, the Arusha peace talks. They were described as the Arusha peace jokes. You could look at Uganda back in
85.
Not 85, yeah, 85, you're right,
Right.
in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi.
Nairobi, yes.
Between a man who was President General Okero Rutwa and a man called Yoweri Museveni and
yes.
Okero. And of course, they signed, they cut a deal at the Intercontinental Hotel.
Right.
But what happened?
We did not hold.
They said those were peace jokes.
Right.
So
I think that's the first time I actually heard the word peace jokes was,
Really?
In relation to the talks of Museveni and Okero.
You could say, having looked at what has been going on really in the Sudan, I don't think some of these people are really serious. I think they are simply interested in retaining power. They don't simply even care about whether, in fact, their people sincerely are doing the dying.
Right.
Whether their people have actually become refugees in their own country, and others have had to run away to neighboring countries and all kind of stuff.
Yes.
We had a program last week, Jackson. We had a panel. One of them was a South Sudanese ambassador called Gordon Boy. Very young man, very smart and what have you. But he was saying that part of the reason, frankly, why they're not cutting a deal is because some of the partners or parties that they're interacting with are not patient. Then I said, what do you mean by patience? I mean, how long can you actually allow your people to do the dying? I mean, the longer you take to come up with a deal that solves your problem, the more people continue to die.
Right.
And I told him, I said, look, you have a country which is supposed to be the youngest in the world. This country was supported by the international community. You used to be part of Sudan, and you eventually, in 2011, got the opportunity to run your own affairs. You inherited an incredibly rich country, wealthy country with the oil to boot, with gold. I have had the opportunity to overfly that country 3 times, Jackson, and I can tell you that it is so incredibly fertile, and yet it is virgin territory.
There's so much potential to
They do not
South
even
Sudan.
have people. They should actually be in the business of attracting people to come and become part of that country so they can develop it.
It's so sad to see.
They're just killing the few they have.
It is so sad to see people receiving food aid. I mean, you're the president of a country that is so fertile, like you say, and you watch on TV as the UN drops food aid on your people.
This is a country that, in fact, should be the bread basket of the region and the Middle East, for that matter. But probably there might be, in fact, some kind of light at the end of the tunnel, or at least something close to that, or a semblance of a light at the end of the tunnel, because the African Union has sort of stepped in right now, and they have actually, the African Union headquarters, I'm talking about the chairperson of the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa, met together with Kenyan President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta and former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga. And they agreed that Amolo Odinga should actually become the mediator, the peace envoy of the AU. And he begins with resuscitating the issues of South Sudan. He spent 7 hours meeting with President Salva Kiir Mayardit in Juba on Friday. And he's supposed to be going to Johannesburg, South Africa,
to meet with
former first Vice President, Dr. Riek Machar. So let's face it, maybe there could be something, because there are people who think, frankly, that IGAD simply does not command the confidence with which to deliver peace in South Sudan. Most of the IGAD leaders who are very powerful, including Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, even Uhuru Kenyatta, some have suggested, and some others, seem to be very partisan to the authorities in Juba. And others also say, when you look at al-Bashir of Sudan And you look at the leadership in Ethiopia, they also somehow seem to be partisan to the other side. So you probably need more than IGAD.
Right.
And of course, you know what the position of the Trump administration in the United States right now does not have confidence, frankly, anymore.
In IGAD.
In South Sudan.
Yes. Yes, yes. Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. This is Shaka Sally, the man himself, host of Straight Talk Africa. And what do you think about Shaka's response to that question of why are the peace talks frailing? Why are peace talks not succeeding to resolve the crisis in South Sudan? Remember to leave your comment below, like this page, share it with your friends, and ask Shaka questions for the next show. Shaka, before we talk about what you're going to have on the show tomorrow, briefly, like you say, time is not our best ally. We have a question from James Basso Okumo, and he wants to find out from you. We always talk about democracy, he writes. Democracy, he says, democracy shouldn't be for the sake of elections, which are in most cases manipulated by our African leaders. You like to say that most of these elections are selections, in your own words, Shaka. And he says, I guess his suggestion is that it must go beyond political boundaries and for the people. What are your thoughts on this, Shaka? Well, James Basso.
I think he has a point. First of all, democracy has, let's face it, at least according to a former great United States president of the 1860s, you're talking about Abraham Lincoln. It should be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And yet, for the most part, these democracies that we see end up being governments of some people, by some people, for some people. And when you talk about elections, really, when you look at Africa, how many elections can you, in fact, call elections? In fact, that reminds me something that I should have said about the Kenyan corruption. This is a point also that had actually been brought out by Dr. David Ndii. And he said, if you really want to deal with corruption in Kenya, the first thing you have to deal with is we have to deal about electoral justice. You have to talk about this issue of a government stealing elections, because that is the single most corrupt act that any society can do.
Taking people's voices.
Precisely. And when you talk about, when you talk about people fighting corruption, they will say, oh, there is no evidence and what have you. How can you talk about there is no evidence? In fact, Transparency International, which is based in Berlin, Germany, which is an international anti-corruption, watchdog and all kind of stuff. It has suggested that all you have to do is introduce what they call lifestyle auditing. Lifestyle auditing. We know, for example, that you are a reporter at the Voice of America. It is very simple to find out, Jackson, how much you earn in a month or a year. We know how much you earn, and we can go to your bank and see what is saved out of that. But if we go to their bank account sincerely, and we should be able to do that very easily, because
if you're a public servant.
Precisely. Because these countries have national intelligence organizations which have unfettered access to everything. And we find that there are
millions of dollars
on your account. Come on, man. What more evidence do you want?
Where did you get the money from?
Sometimes you find some of these individuals have actually like 10 vehicles in their compound, as if it is a parking lot.
So lifestyle audit is the solution.
Some of these guys, they have houses, for example, in Kenya, they have houses in Muthaiga, in Lavington, in Karen. They have houses in London, Hempstead, in Potomac, here in the United States, and what have you. I mean, come on, man. What are you talking about? Evidence? Lifestyle auditing.
That's a great idea.
Could probably be the magic.
I like that idea. Shaka, before we end, we don't have a lot of time left. Give us a preview of what's happening this week on Straight Talk Africa. What are you going to talk about?
We're going to be talking about Africa's second most populous nation, which happens to be Ethiopia, and look at its political transitions, because everybody I talk to seems to think that the new kid on the block, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, that is talking the talk. And this talk seems to be really very great and very inspiring. The question is, can he in fact translate that talk and walk that particular talk so that Ethiopia can actually begin walking the walk?
What do you think?
Well,
based on what you've seen so far.
Well, to be honest with you, I think that it will be simply too early, really, to make a judgment call on this particular individual. I think you have to be patient, allow some time in order for you to, come up, with your assessment. And I think I'll be learning more from the panel tomorrow.
The fact that he's operating within an existing political apparatus.
Precisely.
You think he has
Well, he seems to be talking about opening the political space more. For example, there have been efforts of releasing political prisoners. In fact, there is also another key political prisoner who used to be the chairman of Ginbot or Ginbot 7. He used to be, I think, a citizen of a European country, probably Britain and what have you, and he had to be traveling, and he was arrested in Yemen and eventually handed over to the Ethiopian authorities, and he has been rotting in prison for about 2 years, and they say that they're actually going to release him. I read about that over the weekend.
That's a good development.
I think it's a good development.
There's a lot of positive developments that we're seeing.
There is a journalist called Iskander Nega, who also was in prison.
Bekele Gerba, another.
Bekele Gerba, who also was in prison for like twice, and who used to teach English at the University of Addis Ababa.
Right.
And
so most of these are political opposition figures that had been in jail, have been released slowly by slowly, and you feel like that is a positive development, at least in the beginning of
Well, it looks like when you talk to some of these guys, that's what you really get, because I think the Prime Minister has also, actually his government, has met with the Oromo Liberation Front or something, which has been very radical, and probably, in fact, initially, seem to be moving to the possibility of secession.
Yes.
But right now it looks like they don't mind really being part of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. And after all, let's face it, a man called Abiy Ahmed himself happens to be Oromo. The foreign minister, Oromo. The president, Oromo. So it looks like the Oromo, the largest single group in that country, has really had the opportunity, at least, to make a contribution to being Ethiopian. Thank
you very much, Shaka, and we look forward to that show tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow evening, depending on where you're watching from. And to all of you who joined us today on Shaka Extra Time, my name is Jackson Vunganyi. Remember to tune in tomorrow, Straight Talk Africa with Shaka Sali himself, and send us questions for next week's Shaka Extra Time here. Shaka, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Such a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, General.